We thank you for giving us this beautiful day. We come together and share the stories of our lives and celebrate your wonderful bountifulness for us. We ask you to protect us through this day, protect our families, and keep us safe. In His name, we pray.
Amen.
Good morning. Welcome to the Adult Forum. On behalf of the Racial Reconciliation Committee, my name is Jim Hart. Our committee consists of Ann Rooker, Rachel Holmes, Carol Crone, and Pat Trimmer. We are very pleased to bring you a presentation by representatives of the Montpelier Descendants. And they're going to share with us their efforts to tell a much fuller story of the home of our fourth president, James Madison. Through extensive research, which has included archaeological digs, they have discovered histories of enslaved people who worked, lived, and died at Montpelier. And they have located many living descendants of those enslaved people. Their efforts have become a national model for historical research and commemoration. Reverend Lawrence Ellis Larry Walker Sr. Is the president of the Montpelier Descendants Committee, MDC, an organization that represents descendants of formerly enslaved people at James Madison's Montpelier, as well as at neighboring sites of enslavement throughout the Central Virginia region. In 2022, he was elected as a member of the board of directors at James Montpelier's Montpelier Foundation, where his fifth great-grandfather, Benjamin McDaniel, was enslaved. For more than 35 years, Reverend Walker has been a reliable historian for his family, spending countless hours at Orange County Courthouse and other locations, finding out more and more about his family's origins. Reverend Walker is the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Community Initiatives for the state of Maryland. In this role, he guides the staff that oversees the administration of the state's 6 ethnic commissions, the Maryland Commission on LGBTQIA+ Affairs and Faith Outreach. The agency is responsible for the implementation of Governor Wes Moore's vision to build a caring, inclusive community throughout the state and leaves no one behind. Prior to working for Governor Moore, Reverend Walker was the full-time deputy pastor and chief of staff for Celebration Church at Columbia, Maryland, a congregation of more than 2,000 people. Mr. B. Henry Anglin is a founding member of the Montpelier Descendants Committee and serves on the NBC's Communications and Education Subcommittee. He is also a member of the Montpelier Futures Committee, a cohort of Descendants and Montpelier Foundation board members tasked with addressing parity issues to help ensure a more inclusive narrative. He is the chair of the MDC Memorialization Committee. Mr. Anglin grew up in Orange County's Jacksontown community, founded by his great-grandfather, who was born on the Union Plantation at Bloomfield, adjacent to Montpelier. His grandfather worked at Montpelier. Mr. Anglin brings experience to his roles from the field of education as a former teacher and supervisor, mentor, and business consultant through extensive experience with academic publishing companies such as Oxford University Press. He is a retired vice president of Pearson Publishing. Mr. Anglin graduated from George Washington Carver High School in Culpeper, Bowie State University in Maryland, and earned a graduate degree in education from the University of Pittsburgh. And Ms. Allison James is the Memorialization Project Director for the Montpelier Foundation, and she's my neighbor. Ms. James brings almost 20 years of experience in cultural landscape interpretation and community engagement projects. She brings this experience to the fields of landscape architecture and historic preservation. Her work is focused on documenting, interpreting, and preserving cultural landscapes. While at the UVA Architecture School, Ms. James taught a historic preservation course in cultural landscape interpretation in partnership with the University of Liberia in West Africa. University of Liberia students collaborated with UVA students in this course to develop culturally appropriate multidisciplinary solutions to preservation challenges. She's been leading a field school pilot project in Monrovia, Liberia, named after James Monroe, another president from this area, to train Liberian and UVA students in methods of site survey and preservation while serving as project lead for the feasibility study of Providence Island for the World Monuments Fund. So without further ado, I'll turn the mic over to Allison, and she can begin the program.
Thank you so much for having us today. This is really wonderful. Wonderful opportunity to meet with all of you and really have open up a conversation. Because we're very close. I mean, we're just, in Orange. So it's very close to Charlottesville. It's all part of the same cultural landscape, as you know, and the work that you've done on all of the layers of history here at your church, in your communities, on race and reconciliation, to uncover all of the histories of this place, all inclusively. I don't want to take too much time, but I just want to thank you for having us, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Larry Walker to start us off.
Do I need a mic? Good morning and thank you. Thank you on behalf of the Montpelier Descendants Committee. But before we start, I'd like to just take a moment of silence to recognize the Monacan tribe, the peoples on whose land we all came and on whose land this property rests. Let's take a moment. Amen. So the Montpelier Descendants, it was September 16th, 2020, and the National Trust made an agreement with the Montpelier Foundation to turn over the land formerly known as the DuPont property that was now being turned back into the lifestyle of James Madison. In fast forward 2018, the National Trust in partnership with the Ford Foundation and some scholars brought together a group of scholars to talk about what it would be like to take this property, the newest of the presidential properties, and turn it into a place that people would want to come visit and learn about James Madison and what was going on during his lifetime there. And they came up with a document titled Engaging Descendant Communities, which we call the rubric. It's the gold standard for how do you engage descendant communities into the history that we all grew. I look around, I feel real comfortable in this group. I look around and say, okay, we're all about the same age here. And our history that we were taught, that I was taught in school, didn't include much. We had, when I grew up, there was Black History Week. And in Black History Week, I must tell you, I grew up in a community much like this. This looks like the classroom that I grew up in elementary school. And during Black History Week, everybody always turned and looked at me when it came to talking about slavery. And when on Saturday mornings, as we would, my brother and I would watch television after we did our chores, of course. One of the main programs that we watched was Tarzan. Johnny Weissmuller swinging through the trees in Africa, where everybody else spoke in some dialect that was indiscernible, with limited clothes on and looking crazy. And that was my indoctrination to what my ancestors might have looked like. And it was a very sterile indoctrination. But as I got older and I was the curious kid. I was the kid who wanted to listen to the conversations from family members. And somewhere back here in the back, and back then I had hair, but somewhere back there, many of those stories were stored, and to hear about James Madison and Dolly Madison, and I didn't understand the connection. The biggest thing I knew about Dolly Madison was I loved Dolly Madison apple pies. But as I got older and started really being curious to find the crumbs, the trails that took me there, one of my earlier careers had me covering Western Virginia. So I came down 29 and I covered everything west. I would come to Charlottesville and make a left and going west to Roanoke and Wytheville and in the west. And I would plan my trip so that on the way back, and I'm talking the late 1989, on my way back, I would stop in the courthouse. I would stay in Charlottesville on Thursday night, and then work this area on Friday, and then spend the afternoon in the courthouse until they closed, digging through records and tying the names of family members that I had heard about. And then I'd go home on either Friday night or Saturday and call my aunt in Pittsburgh and tell her about all the names I found, and then have her help me figure out how they went together. And I still have that legal pad that I wrote on all those years ago. And before I turn the mic over to Henry, one of the things that was interesting, I would go once, twice a month, and one of the clerks at the courthouse asked me very, very politely what I was looking for. And as I shared with her, and she would guide me. Sometimes I would ask for help. I'm looking for birth records and death records and deeds of sale. And she said, "Do you know Clara Ellis Payne?" "No." And she said, "Well, there's a lady that comes down who grew up here, but she now lives in New York, and she comes down from Harlem a couple times a year, and I think you might be related because she's looking for the same people." And I gave her my business card, and the next time Clara came down, she gave Clara my business card, and we connected, and come to find we're cousins that never knew each other, tracing back the same family history. And Clara, who is in heaven now, was a couple decades older than me, so she had done a whole lot more work. But growing up in the area, she was far more familiar with a lot of the names and connections, and she kept all of her family's documents in a big chest, and she would share things with me and just really help me put the breadcrumbs together. And so really excited to be able to go back and now take the name of my fifth great grandfather, Benjamin McDaniel, who I had heard about, but now really tie that together. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Henry. Benjamin McDaniel was one of the drivers for the Madison family. And there's a document, a pass, which is one of the last known written documents from Dolly Madison. It was a slave pass that's housed at a museum in New York, where she was writing a pass for him to go from their plantation up to, and the name was in my head and it just left me, but up north to fetch Dr. Hinkle and return Monday, Tuesday next. And when I think about that, and in my head I'm thinking, okay, if he's got a pass and he's going up a few miles south of the Pennsylvania border, or why doesn't he just keep going? And as a father and a grandfather, and his wife did not live on Montpelier, and he had children, otherwise I wouldn't be standing before you. And so it helped me to understand the challenge that enslaved communities had, wanting freedom, but yet needing to stay close to their family, and the faith that would have them trust God to see them through. So that today I can stand here as a member of the board of directors at the plantation site where my grandfather had no agency over his life.
Now, how'd I follow up? Okay. Listening to some of your stories, I think I'm a little older than most people here. And the crowds that I was talking to didn't look like this, not at all. I grew up, you talked about southwestern Virginia. I was born in Martinsville, Virginia. The Anglins there in Martinsville, Virginia, come from the Anglin plantation in Stewart County. I don't know a lot about that side of the family with the history, but that's where they came from. And the groups that I was talking to, I went to school in Orange, graded school, two-room building, and until about the third grade, and then we had a nice elementary school. So it's a little bit different experience I think I had as we were coming up. And then going to George Washington Carver High School, same thing. Different population, different experience. The backgrounds, we had a lot of information, a lot of stories told to us. My sister was very good at that. My cousins were very good at it. Half the time I didn't listen. So I had to rely on them later on in dates to give me information about some of the things that are part of the history of our family. I guess myself, I was a hard-headed person, I guess, at that time. But as far as, and I grew up there in Jacksontown, which was right next to Montpelier. And the connections there and my relatives there were kind of deep. I was looking at some of the things and kind of put some notes here to keep myself on track. And you started out talking about the Native Americans. And my great-great-great-grandmother was given to an American Indian. And they got married, and his name ended up in the records being Andrew Jackson, although we don't know the Native American name. Even before that, there are connections to, I'll bring up another connection. There's Nancy Barber, who was a free individual who was brought to this country for the purpose of teaching English and also American custom. Her name was Nancy. The name that it went by was Nancy Barber. And the person that brought her over here was Governor Barber. So you figure out the connections, whatever, But that was really kind of like a starting point in that whole Montpelier area, Newman Plantation area, Arlington Plantation. That was kind of like a big starting point. And then they had different children. And from that, I ended up with my great-great-grandfather, Alan Jackson, who married, and he married later, but before that, he has half brothers and half sisters that are listed in the census records, quite a few of them. But he was actually a son of the plantation owner, the Newmans, the Newman plantation, and so that's another thing. So that was and looking at the records and looking at some of the writings that I saw from some of the family people, they were saying that he was a little different because he was kind of like an outcast to a certain extent, but then everybody accepted him later on. And then ended up getting married. When he got married, he actually stayed beyond emancipation there at the Newman plantation for a number of years. And then once they had two children, they ended up leaving, and he and another Jackson started Jacksontown. There was a Jonah Jackson and John Jackson and then Alan Jackson. And neither one of them, their names weren't the Jacksons, but that's what they ended up adopting that name. And so hence Jacksontown. And so Jacksontown basically was like 14 different families there. And they started their community, they established a church, they established a community center, they had a store, they had other things there. It really started like a whole community there at that area. And that's basically where I grew up, on the same property there. And my grandfather worked at Montpelier during the DuPont's time. And he was a carpenter. I guess he's supposed to be the head carpenter and a cabinet maker and those kinds of things. And his brother also worked there, same occupation. So the connections are there. I can go on and on. The nice thing about it was that my grandfather originally wanted to be a pharmacist. And he started in school, but then he dropped out of school because he also had brothers that wanted to go to school. So somebody had to support somebody. And so he actually started working at Montpelier, and his brothers actually went to school, became doctors. They started a practice in Orange, then moved to Richmond, started the Richmond Community Hospital there. He was one of the co-founders of that. This goes on and on. I could talk more and more about that background, but the thing is, what we're looking at there, as far as memorialization is concerned, we're looking at the history of the individuals that were there. We want to really make sure that we understand their situations there, their, how they toiled, how they succeeded, what contributions they made. That's all a part of it. Jacksontown, I was talking to somebody who was talking about cemeteries down here. And myself, some other people and the archaeology people there at Montpelier went over to Jacksontown, and we've actually found a cemetery that was over there. And so that's an area that we'll have to do additional research, because part of the thing that we're doing at Montpelier as far as memorialization, it's not just Montpelier. We're looking at the whole community as a whole. And because there's an interconnection throughout that whole area, and that's important.
Thank you, Henry. As Henry says, and I talked a little bit about this rubric, but when the land was turned over to the Montpelier Foundation, they recognized that there was a cemetery, some anomalies in the ground. So they recognized that there was probably a cemetery there on the property, and they knew that the foundation staff couldn't speak for the descendant community, so they invited all of the descendants of record that they had in 2018 to come to the property to learn about what they had found. And so that was, and that's where I first met Henry, and it was Juneteenth weekend of 2018. And we had a great presentation of some of the things they were doing. And then we came back a year later, the Juneteenth weekend of 2019, and established the Montpelier Descendants Committee so that we would be the official voice of the descendant community. I would say that the Montpelier Descendants Committee represents not just descendants who can trace their familial roots back to Montpelier property, because as I said, my great-grandfather lived there, but his wife and children lived on a different property. We know that as we trace the history of enslavement, that people were bought, sold, traded, and working at a number of different locations throughout the region. And so we desire to represent those who want to be a part of the Descendants Committee, from Fredericksburg in the east to the Blue Ridge Mountains, south to here in Charlottesville, and back east to Richmond. More than 800 square mile area where we recognize from the historical perspective that there were a lot of families who were bought, sold, traded, brought here. I trace, and when I talk about Montpelier, I'm thinking about one side of my mother's family. Another side of my mother's family was enslaved on Zachary Taylor's parents' plantation. On my father's side, his family comes from Greene and Rappahannock County. So both sides of my family, while my parents were both born and met in Pittsburgh, as I trace the family records, both sides of my family are right here from Central Virginia, within this area of the Arc. And so, as we've been, Henry is the chair, as you heard, the chair of our memorialization project. And what we're doing with the memorialization, we recently read, you might have read it in the paper or heard about the $5.8 million grant that we received from the Mellon Foundation to build a memorial on that property representing the people whose lives were entombed there at Montpelier. But our desire is to use the home of the Constitution to talk about how do we bring unity to the country. How do we use a document that was written that didn't include our families, but today includes all of us? How do we use the foundation of James Madison's Montpelier to create a place where people whose ancestors were enslaved anywhere in the country? Because as I travel around and talk to other descendant communities, many, I'm going to get controversial here for a minute. Those of us who are old enough to remember, and I'm not one of those, when I think it was President Truman that started the highway system. Eisenhower, I'm sorry. Thank you. See, there you go. You throw out a name, and that's when you got to depend on the audience. So as these highways are being built so that we can connect communities, they're being built right through black communities. They're being built and separating people. And now we have, and I talked to dozens of communities where there's a highway over top of what used to be a vibrant community for people. And in many cases, cemeteries. I was at a conference this summer, and there was a lady who was talking about a building that was built in Frederick, Maryland, over the community where her family lived, and they found on some edge of the parking lot as they were about to expand, they found the anomalies that there was once a cemetery there. Well, it's very difficult to go and know where on the highway on 64 that's paved over where your ancestors were buried. And so we want to make Montpelier be a sacred place where everyone can come and pay homage to their ancestors who lived. Because as the Sankofa principle says, we have to look back to know where we came from in order to move forward to where we're going. And we want to make Montpelier the preeminent museum site in the nation. We want to make Montpelier the place that everyone across the world comes to see what it looks like when the descendant community, partnering with the broader community, can tell a fuller story. We're not at all looking to minimize the contributions, the great contributions of James and Dolly Madison. But we're looking to tell a fuller story of the people whose work and labor made their lives possible. And I see a hand in the audience.
No, I think maybe they might have questions.
That's right where I was going, okay. Questions, we want to pass the mic, questions?
I don't need a mic, I don't think.
Speak up.
Okay. I just wondered if there are remnants of Jacksontown that you were talking about. Is there remnants of the town, or is it still got a store and some other things?
At this point, no, there's no store there. There's still a few of the original houses there, not very many at all now. I think right now there's probably only about 4 houses still left over there. And So it's quite different now than it was. And it's, you know, the thing about it is that cemetery is one that's is sacred and one that we need to make sure that we preserve as a part of that. The school the school building is no longer there. I know where it was. We found a location for it, but it's changed since then.
Is there an effort to put up historical markers?
Interesting question. One of another part of another project we're working on is called Arc of Communities, and Larry's talking about the connections with all the different communities and the history that's related to all of that. And one of the things that we're starting to do is to work on a plan of working with communities. You know, you have information about some strategic areas that are important to you and that people need to know about. And that's all around these whole counties all around here. And so what this project is designed to do is to kind of consolidate all of that and put it together so the things that you're working on, the things that this person is working on, that person, now it's known to the public as a whole. We're not taking credit away from anybody developing it, but just making it be more accessible.
If I could, we have a baby in the back. How old is the baby? 5 months. Think about that 5-month-old baby 15 years from now in a school building learning about American history. American history that includes everyone. American history that includes the indigenous community that was housed on this land, the enslaved Africans who worked the land, and the Europeans who worked to build this country. This was the most fertile area of thought in the colonial period. When we look at this central Virginia area, the United States of America became the strongest, most economically powerful country in the world because of the thought leaders that came out of this region where you live. And so our desire is, with this ARC project, is to be able to build a national trail that would connect sites like Jacksontown as they are found and rediscovered back, because there was a time when vibrant African American communities, because of, if you live in a place where you're economically you have challenges, you're looking to seek. That's why we have an immigration problem here in America today, right? People coming from impoverished countries wanting to come here for the opportunities that are here. And so we have many people from the enslaved community who left and went to places like Washington, D.C. or Pittsburgh or places south to find employment. And the few people that remained behind oftentimes couldn't keep up the communities where they lived. And we're saying, let's go find those places and put up the markers and tell the fuller stories and dig deep and learn the history and share it.
Yep.
So I wanted to, first of all, I'd like to say that when it came up that there was such a thing as a Descendants Committee at Montpelier, we joined Montpelier. We were so proud and glad. And I remember that there was some controversy about people on the Descendants Committee being on the board. And I wondered what happened about that. I thought it was a great idea, but I think I read things in the paper. Some people weren't as excited about it. So I just wanted to make sure y'all were still on the board.
So, yeah.
TMF board member right here.
So the answer to that is there were some people on the board who I'll call it the legacy board, the board before there were a number of descendants on the board. The establishment of the rubric said parity. We want to operate in parity from top down, which means don't just have 1 or 2 tokens on the board, but allow the descendant community to identify representatives who would represent them on the board. And that's where the legacy board kind of had problems. They wanted to go to specific people that they knew, as opposed to allowing those of us who were descendants to pick our leadership. And that's what the big fight was about.
Did it all work out?
It all. So we were finally able, you read it in the paper. It wasn't God honoring in any way. It wasn't something that would, in my opinion, she called me Reverend today because I have my collar. But it wasn't something that I believe honored the love that we're taught to live as human beings, because that's where we all start, right? We're created in the image of God as human beings. It worked out in that the representatives from the Descendant Committee were seated on the board. However, members of the Legacy Board stepped down, so that instead of having equal numbers, there were now more representatives from the Descendant community than from the broader community, and we're working to change that as we bring new people on the board. But one of the challenges to that fight was people stepped away and said, okay, let's wait and see what happens when the dust settles. And many people pulled their resources from Montpelier. And imagine what it would be like if you had a standard cost to existing, and now all of a sudden the income that you were receiving to help maintain that standard is gone, or a big portion of it is gone. You still have to operate. We don't want to close Montpelier. And so for the last 2 years, we've been really working to tell that fuller story and to invite people to come and participate in honoring not only James Madison and Dolly Madison, but the descendant community and Montpelier as a whole, and its place in American history as we work to make it the preeminent museum site. Yes?
I'd like to go back to your comment about children touring Montpelier. During the early to mid-'80s, I taught social studies at Orange County, and every year I would take my students to Montpelier. And I think about the story then and how the story has changed and the richness that you all have added because of the work that you're doing and what those just young people at Prospect Heights Middle School or wherever, what they're hearing today versus what they heard in the early to mid-'80s. And so I thank you for that, because it really enriches those children to have a broader perspective as they move forward.
And the
So
nice
I thank
thing,
you for that.
Thank
the
you.
nice thing about it is not taken away from the history that you've learned in the past. It's actually adding to it.
Right.
That's the reality.
I think we've got 6 minutes left. And that's why I appreciate that, because that's where we're talking about a 5-month-old who'll grow up and know the full history. I believe, I'm in a church, so I'm safe. I believe when we all get to heaven, we will look like we look now. God wants us to practice getting along and loving each other today, so that when we get to heaven, because we're going to spend eternity together, right? We're created in the image of a God who is eternal. And while we live in a mortal space, immortality is going to hit all of us at some point. I think we're going to have to answer to God for how we treat each other while we're here. And so I'm just very excited and grateful for the opportunity to come and share a little bit of our history and invite you to come be a part of it. You can join the Montpelier Descendants Committee as a affiliate member. I had to get the terminology right. You can join Montpelier as a member. We are grateful for your participation in the work we're doing, and we just look forward to continuing to build on the opportunity that you've given us.
And I just want to say we have more to say about the memorial and the memorialization process. the visioning process all the way through, and the committee has been working for the past year. I've had the honor of being hired to do this work with them. And it's been an iterative process, very iterative process of back and forth between committee and board, between foundation, committee and board, between community, foundation, committee, on and on. Conversation, constant conversations, constant deep work around figuring out what their vision is, what the design might look like, doing some deep work into exploring architects, and looking at different designs that have been made across the country and what theirs might look like, spending time with the archaeologists who are so dedicated. Dr. Matt Reeves has been so dedicated to descendant work for his entire career. So we're so lucky to have him. And just all of this work to get to where we are now, which is then hiring a design firm to start to work on this project. So the whole last year has been really intense in that way, but in a good way. To the point where they have led the vision. They have gotten to a point where they're deciding on the vision for their memorial. And, you know, and then what we get to do is see the results of that real community engagement. So the first part of that memorial is covered by the Mountain Grant. The rest of it will be, how do we continue to tell the stories of this commemorative landscape across this whole region? And so
while 5.7 million sounds like a lot of money, not a lot when they talk about memorial, and it has nothing to do with operating expenses of Montpelier.
Right, right. So please do stay engaged with the process and with the project. And thank you so much for inviting us to come out today to speak with your community. We have another.
And so before we turn this over to Jim, can I take a selfie?
I just wanted to say, several years ago, I served on one of the strategic committees at Montpelier. And at that time, we were discussing starting up a brewery on grounds. I don't know if any of you were involved at that point. What I see Montpelier doing now is extremely courageous. It would be real easy to start a brewery and have weddings and events and things like that. You're taking it to a whole different path. And I'm amazed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, thanks very, very much for coming, and to our guests for giving us this excellent program. I don't know if you know, but Mr. Anglin and Mr. Walker came from Maryland for this event. Back home. And Allison, thank you very much for keeping connected with us, the Racial Reconciliation Committee, and Rachel Carroll. Pat, we're planning something for the spring for our group to do what we call field trips now, to get out there and see.
We can arrange that easily.
What you're digging up.
Would you want to do some digging too, archaeologists? Yeah, I mean, there are times that you can do that.
Happening with the archaeology and the burial ground and the sacred way that we're really handling all of that. Right?
And I'm big on pictures, so before you get up, I would like us to come behind you, to come up front and take a picture of all of us together. How's that?